Welcome to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are going to be talking about, and for some of you, some of the listeners, revisiting a tshuva of Rav Asher Weiss on OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, many people call this a famous tshuva. I'm not supposed to call things famous because if someone never heard of it, then it's not famous. But if you are a fan of Shiloh's Tshuvos, which I assume by listening to this podcast, you have some general interest, you may have heard of this tshuva of Rav Asher Weiss on OCD in the past. And if you haven't, we're going to talk about it anyway, and you'll learn about it for the first time. But what's really important about this discussion we're going to have is that I didn't just simply invite another rabbi on to summarize and schmooze about the tshuva with me, but I thought it was very important because this is a very fundamental recent source in the entire discussion of halacha mental health. I wanted to bring on someone who's not only a rabbi, but also a mental health professional who can analyze this tshuva from both the halachic standpoint and from the clinical psychological standpoint as well. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Dr. Saul Haimoff, who is a clinical psychologist in private practice with a specialty in treating children, adolescents, and young adults with anxiety and behavioral disorders. He currently serves as the program director and associate rabbi of the Jewish Center of Atlantic Beach. Additionally, he is the co-author of the Handbook of Torah and Mental Health, which catalogs over 50 Jewish sources that are related to mental health treatments, diagnoses, and theories, and are supported by peer-reviewed studies. He has given lectures, workshops, and trainings to clinicians, schools, parents, and the general community on various topics related to religion and mental health. And so I couldn't think of a better guest to have on to discuss such an important tshuva related to Torah and mental health. We're going to be talking about Rav Asher Weiss's tshuva, and I believe this is actually the first tshuva of Minchas Asher we are discussing on the podcast. So, Rabbi Haimoff, if you could tell us just very briefly about Rav Asher Weiss, about the significance of this tshuva, where it's coming from, and what do we have to know about it?
Thank you so much, Rabbi Kurt, for that warm introduction. It's an honor to be here today, and looking forward to a very meaningful and educational conversation. So, yeah, Rav Asher Weiss is a huge Talmid Chacham, has been very prolific in his writing. He's the author of the Minchas Asher, a 5-volume set on Chumash, as well as many svarim with explanations and commentary on Masechtas and Gemara, and has come out with a Shilas V'Tshuvas as well, the Shilas V'Tshuvah of Rav Asher Weiss. He's American born, lives in Israel right now. He's a Klausenberger Chassid, and which I think is actually going to be relevant for the tshuva. You see some actually what I think some crossover to some nice Hasidic ideas, and a Diana Rosh Kol has yeshiva in Israel, and just considered, I think, by many one of the greatest kind of poskim in our generation.
Absolutely. I think something unique about Rav Asher Weiss is that he really has influence throughout the Orthodox world. He's mainly situated, as you mentioned, more in the Haredi community, but also many people who are in the OU, YU circles turn to him for guidance as well. He's known for being not just erudite, but also having a strong handle on the metzius, on the facts on the ground and common sense. And I think you're going to assess his understanding of the facts on the ground when we discuss his tshuva. So wonderful. Let's discuss. So what exactly is the shaila? Where does OCD come into tension and conflict with halacha?
Yeah, great question. I will give some word of introduction and background. I gave one of the talks I've given when I lecture on this topic is called "The Thin Line Between Piety and Pathology," and really in halacha, in our Jewish observance, there are so many levels. We're in the time of Hanukkah now. We talk about Mahadran, Min Mahadran. There are so many extra stringencies that one could take upon themselves, and it becomes a big question: at what point is it a healthy religious spiritual expression of faith and devotion, or on the other hand, is it something more pathological, something unhealthy, something that's even clinically diagnosed as a mental health disorder, such as OCD, where someone has obsessional thoughts compulsions of always trying to do extra to make sure they're doing the right thing, to the point that it's beyond the normalcy of what someone from that typical community would do.
So what would be examples just of OCD in the general world? And then maybe we could talk about its applications for someone who is devoutly religious.
Sure, great question. And OCD has received a lot of depictions in modern pop culture, but defined in clinical terms, the O stands for machshavos, thoughts. It's a mental process of having obsessional thoughts, intrusive thoughts that kind of repeat or get stuck in one's head. And cause anxiety or doubt. It's also sometimes referred to as the doubting disease, which is very important in this tshuva we're going to talk about today. And then there are compulsions. Compulsions are what I call pu'ulot, actions, behaviors, where someone has a ritualistic or repeating things a certain amount of times until it feels right, needing to do things in a certain order, or not sure if one did something and having to go back and check repeatedly. So making sure you locked your door, making sure you turned your oven off. And again, when I assess for this in my practice, it's not just once or twice. It's a really a debilitating
Right,
amount of
you
times.
got me worrying because I'm one of those people who checks the lock on his door 3 times. And it happens to be I grew up in not the safest neighborhood, so
Mm.
maybe that was the stressor that caused that to come into
Well,
place.
there you go.
But
There's
I'm very
context. Yeah, is that right? Yeah, people always say, "Oh, I hear when people even pull into my office, I hear how many times they lock their car. 2 times, 3 times. I think that's considered a
oh
normal
God,
amount of
that's me.
times." Yeah, but anything more than that, it's pervasive into so many areas, to the point that the person really doesn't have control over it.
Right. And so I think again, you're an actual expert in psychology. I'm a guy who just like most pre-smicha people got a BA in psychology. But
Sure.
if I remember correctly, for something to constitute a disorder, like you said, it's when it becomes debilitating. You
Mm,
can't function, you can't
yeah.
live your life properly. I think one of the examples that gets raised, and I'm wondering if you see this manifestation of OCD, comes with pre-Pesach cleaning.
Oh, yes.
Especially one of the things I like to remind people is that you're only over bali or bali matzah. There's only an issue of retaining chametz if it's a minimum of a kazayas.
Hmm.
Maybe they, and it's maybe especially if you hold that a kazayas is a huge shear, right?
Yeah.
Lakula, maybe it's not something to worry about. But do you see kind of OCD being manifested in those practices?
Yes, definitely. And as I heard from Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg, we're turning chametz into dust and not dust into chametz. And
Ah, that's a good
right,
that's a good
we're not.
little
Yeah, it's a very
tidbit.
nice thing. I love that idea. Right, we do kol chamir. We're saying our chametz is like dust, but the dust under your refrigerator or your oven is not chametz.
Mhm.
In fact, I'll give a plug, a shout out to the book that you mentioned that I co-authored. Now, I'll hold it up for anyone watching, the Handbook of Torah and Mental Health. We have a chapter here on OCD, and the example we give as a Torah source is actually a Mishnah in Psachim that talks about cleaning your house for Pesach. Of do we have to be choshesh, worried that a chulda, a weasel, some type of rodent, took a piece of chametz from one house and brought it to another house? And the Mishnah says that you don't have to drive yourself crazy, so to speak. Ein the davar sof. There's no end to the amount of possibilities that we could think of, and therefore, do the best you can, and that's enough. Which is a very important idea in OCD. Rav Asher Weiss, actually, we'll see soon, quotes that phrase as well, Ein the davar sof. So yes, Judaism could trigger many symptoms of anxiety and OCD, especially around Pesach, where the stakes are so high, and they're, kares, the punishment for owning chametz, is so severe, and it could really play into someone's nervous tendencies to the point that they really are unhealthy in their cleaning for Pesach.
Right. And it's a difficult thing that
Mm,
whenever you see someone who's very medactic in
mm,
mitzvos, on the one hand, one might say, oh, I should really admire him. But when does that dikduk in mitzvos, I suppose once it becomes debilitating and they can't move
right.
on without doing it, that's when it's no longer something to be commended for. And it's sometimes hard for the outside observer to really determine that.
Yes, exactly.
So just one more question before we jump into the content of the tshuva. Does religion, especially halachic
Mm,
observance, right? We're not just about feeling, feel good
mm,
religion and spirituality. We have actual obligations with shiurim and measurements for
mm,
what we have to do. So would halachic observance, you know I asked Mechila if I'm phrasing this irreverently, does it exacerbate someone who has OCD, or is it just another manifestation of it?
That's a great question. It's the top, $1 million question that's asked in talks about OCD in the Jewish community. So what I've seen, based on the survey, the research is that the research shows that, OCD is not more pronounced, is not more common in the Orthodox Jewish community than in comparison, proportionally to the general population, but it is more likely to be expressed in religious ways. So that if someone has OCD and they're religious, they're more likely to express their OCD in religious ways. And like you mentioned, halacha has so many different rules to follow. You put on your right shoe first, and then you tie your left shoe first, and different ways to clean yourself in the bathroom. And there's so many areas. There is no area of halacha of life that halacha doesn't touch, and it definitely is ripe for kind of a compulsive problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So jumping into the tshuva. So Rav Asher Weiss, he's not really dealing with chametz so much. I don't remember if he makes an offhand reference to it, but he's talking about OCD. What's the particular challenge that comes to his desk?
Sure, and I'll read a little bit from it, and I'll go over it. And it's actually fascinating, because I had an exact case just like this that I worked with clinically with an Orthodox man, which is how I originally came to discover this tshuva, because the shaila was the exact same shaila that my patient was dealing with. And so it is actually a very common expression of OCD, especially in the Orthodox world. So he calls me Talmid Chacham Muflag V'yirei Shemayim, a great Torah scholar with fear of heaven. And he talks about how the person asking the question says that he's struggling with OCD, epsiode, he says, and his particular issue is pronouncing brachas, saying the text of the blessings, and specifically the name of God, the Shem Hashem, which is the essence of the blessing, and needs to be pronounced a particular way. And his obsessions and his compulsions are whether he pronounced it properly, and he finds himself needing to repeat it. Doesn't say how many times, but many times over again until he says it properly. And then he goes on to say that he's worried about making blessings, about washing to eat bread and to say Birkat Hamazon afterwards. He wants to avoid any situations of having to make blessings because he because he feels like he's not saying the blessings properly, so maybe best to minimize as many blessings as possible.
So he's like avoiding eating because it'll bring him into that situation. So that's certainly debilitating if you can't even have a healthy relationship with food, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. He's doing things that are beyond the norm for that community. And he what's interesting about this specific question is that he says that he's in therapy, right? And Rav Asher Weiss says, "L'data rofim hamumchim b'tchum zeh," according to the doctors and the experts in this area. So it's really nice. Derech hatipul, he says the therapy is olam lo yachzir pamayim al dibor or tefillah. You're not. He said the therapist told him he's not allowed to go back and repeat it. He's doing what's called exposure and response prevention, exposure therapy, which is the gold standard clinical treatment for OCD, is to go against your compulsions, not to give in to them. It's this voice in your head, almost like a Yetzer Hara is telling you, do it again. Maybe you didn't say it right. Maybe you didn't do it right. You have to go back. And the therapist is coaching the patient, don't listen to that voice. Ignore, do the opposite of what it says. If it's saying to repeat it, don't repeat it.
So if I keep locking my car door, once I lock it, put the keys in your pocket, don't touch it again. That's
Exactly. And, with coaching and guidance from a trained therapist, because that's easier said than done, right? If you could do that, you wouldn't have OCD, obviously. So, so how to do that properly is very important, especially when you want to make sure that even mentally the person's thought process is not pathological as well.
Right. And so I can imagine, just from a halachic standpoint, since, vast majority of brachos, we understand, are instituted rabbinically, the halachic stakes are a little bit lower. Though, if I recall correctly, he also talks about the mitzvah of reciting Kriya Shema, which is midoraisa. It's biblically mandated.
Right.
And I think that creates like a more of a halachic challenge about what kind of leeway there is to be mevatel, to neglect fulfilling a mitzvah, say, or at least in his mind, he's being mevatel, not say.
Right, exactly. Well, that's the most important part of this discussion is what happens when a treatment, it could be a medical treatment, or in our case, is a mental health treatment, flies in the face or contradicts halacha. What you do in that situation where the doctors are telling you need to eat non-kosher, the medication is not kosher, or in our situation, you need to not repeat Shema or the brachas, and you may not even be Yotze, and the doctors are saying, the psychologists are saying, you're not allowed to repeat. That's going to feed into your O.C.D. So he's basically asking, how am I Yotzei brachas? How am I fulfilling the mitzvahs of Shema if the treatment is telling me to go against halacha, so to speak?
Right. So even if I intellectually know that I mispronounced a word in Shema, I guess knowing is a tough term to use here, because I guess the compulsion is telling him that it's making him doubt it. But the question is, can we tell him halachically, even if you 100% bevados know that you didn't pronounce it correctly, you still don't go back because that would impede your therapy.
Exactly.
So what would be the halachic argument? I mean, we're talking about a mitzvah midoraisa here. That's pretty heavy stuff. So what's the argument that Rav Asher makes? Does he say that's okay?
Yeah, sure. That's basically the bulk of the tshuva, is him going with the premise that you may not be Yotze the brachas or Kriyat Shema, and here are all the reasons why it's okay anyway, halachically, using some really fascinating halachic principles, and some that I think are what we call super halachic, like kind of going into the meaning. He talks about specifically about prayer, being more of a feeling and a heartfelt kind of personal spiritual mitzvah as opposed to other mitzvahs, and maybe that's enough, like your intention or your effort.
Right. So prayers avodas halev. So because that's like a service that we're connecting to God on a subjective level. So, but I guess the issue with that argument is that, as we mentioned, O.C.D. can manifest in many different ways that require deeds, such as cleaning for Pesach.
Right.
So this helps when O.C.D. manifests in recitation of brachos and Shema, but that argument wouldn't help as when we get to Maisim, when we're talking about actual deeds.
Yeah.
But I did notice in Os Aleph toward the beginning, he makes the argument that we know that you're not expected to be mevazvis yosem echomesh al mitzvah say, that you don't have to give more than a fifth of your assets to fulfill a positive mitzvah. Now, Shema might be midoraisa, but it's a positive mitzvah. And so the same way there is a limit on how much money you have to sacrifice to fulfill a mitzvah, his argument seems to be there's a limit on how much mental anguish, how much of your health you have to give over to fulfill that. I'll just mention something to you. I love your perspective as a mental health professional. Not so long ago, I put together a sugya, a shiur on the sugya of istinus in halacha, those who are overly sensitive to the heat. And I saw, I think it was in Binyan Shlomo, that he makes an argument for someone who's mitzdayer, someone who feels a lot of discomfort psychologically. Also, there is a limit to how much tsar, how much distress one has to endure in order to fulfill a mitzvah. Not just when it comes to sukkah and things that have built-in dispensations, but in kol haTorah kula. So I don't know if istinus comes in to your mental health discussion.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because everyone has their own levels of comfort, and the key clinical term here is scrupulosity, which is a term for people who are overly scrupulous. They have an obsession with being kind of religious and meticulous with religion, and it's, to some degrees, it's a personality-based difference, where some people are more comfortable or tolerant of doubt or uncomfortable situations, and other people have perfectionist tendencies and need to do something the best way or the most perfect way possible. And that kind of that's where the question comes in, is how much of that is their own personality governing their religion, or is it really a religious practice? And like you mentioned, Rav Asher Weiss, he talks about the difference between positive commandments and negative commandments, where over here, the worst case scenario, so to speak, was that he failed to fulfill a positive commandment by reciting Shema or saying a blessing, which he argues, I don't know if you want to get the technicalities about whether eating without saying a blessing is just a bittul kiyamase, a failure to fulfill a positive commandment, or lo taseh, right? Is there a sin involved in eating without a blessing? But he seems to make the point that, the worst case scenario is that you're not doing a positive commandment, and that your health, your status of a chole here takes precedence over that.
Right. Though it's interesting is I guess this beckons us to, this begs the question, would we go so far as to say that one can violate a losas, say one could violate an isser in the Torah in order to help one's health? And I think in O.C.D, moving further into tshuva, he seems to make an analogy to breaking Shabbos. He says, he quotes the Gemara, which says, "Mutav sheichal Shabbos achas v'yichal Shabbos harbe," that we make a sacrifice, we'll break one Shabbos so you could keep future Shabbos, which I found to be just such an interesting analogy, because it seems to be a svara which is unique to Hilchos Shabbos. And here he is extrapolating it to breaking anything in the Torah. He brings in the Chassam Sofer, I believe, as well.
Right, sure, yeah.
You want to talk about that case in the Chassam Sofer?
Yeah, and that Shabbos analogy does come up a lot in the mental health and halachic literature, which is now starting to trickle in more and more as this tshuva by Rav Asher Weiss is really a landmark tshuva in paskening on what to do in a situation where a therapy, and we'll talk about even the type of therapist here. Of course, someone with an Orthodox background, or in my case, I have smicha as a rabbi, is extra sensitive to the halachic issues, and yet, our job, we take a Hippocratic oath, is to do no harm and to do what's best for our client or our patient. And sometimes those interventions do actually violate prohibitions in the Torah. The classic case is for usually a young woman, an Orthodox woman, who needs to be hospitalized in a special treatment facility for eating disorders. Is a very common shaila, where she needs to be, she's at danger of starving herself to death. And there's not many, maybe there'll be more in the future, but there's not many from or kosher programs. So they'll have to be eating non-kosher food. And from what I've seen in the literature, many poskim allow that, unequivocally, because it's a pikuach nefesh. It's for their health. And so here too, when it comes to Shabbos, he quotes basically a similar scenario of a nice tshuva from the Chassam Sofer about something interesting. Someone who's lost in the desert and they don't know what day Shabbos is. So even though they have to keep the prohibitions of Shabbos, he says they're allowed to still try and escape the desert. They're allowed to go outside the Techum to violate Shabbos in order to save themselves and to be rescued. So he compares that to our situation here, where yes, you're technically violating a halacha, but you're leaving the Techum, you're leaving the desert, and that will allow you to fulfill many more mitzvahs in a much better way.
Absolutely. And I think this Chassam Sofer, if I recall correctly, Rav Moshe had a similar case about someone being, I don't know if maybe the terminology has changed, so forgive me if that's not the right term, but someone was put in an institution or institutionalized. Is there a more...
I guess admitted to an inpatient.
Admitted to inpatient.
Yeah.
I figured there was some updated way of saying it. Okay.
That wasn't the worst way.
The intuition was correct on that. That's good to hear. Yeah. So this Chassam Sofer, I believe, gets cited in Igros Moshe also. Like, this is like the golden precedent for someone who, I think his case was someone was a shota, someone lacked basic mental faculties, and putting them in this inpatient place would be able to heal them, but they would be eating non-kosher food in the interim. But nonetheless, we look at the full picture of being able to bring them back to a healthy state of mind. That is something that we can violate one Shabbos, so to speak, in order to fulfill others. Fascinating. Yeah. Also, what really grabbed my attention is that toward the end of O.C.D, he mentions that he invokes Gedola Aveira Lishma. The idea of doing an Aveira with good intentions is sometimes permissible. And he seems to, after marshaling all these different svaros, he says, and you know what? Maybe it's an Aveira Lishma, which is it's remarkable that he invokes that.
Yeah, it's incredible. In fact, it's highlight. I have all things highlighted on my page, in my notes. That phrase, the Gedola Aveira Lishma, which is of course, a slippery slope and such a dangerous thing to say. But I think, getting back to Rav Asher Weiss's Hasidic background, which I mentioned in the intro, you could try to answer every halachic shaila, from a purely technical halachic analysis of whether something is mutter or aser. But As Rav Asher Weiss says in another place in this tshuva, ain't a davar sof, and many I've heard from many rabbanim and poskim who serve kehilas and congregations that with one answer comes 10 more questions, right? And having a overarching principle that could really, kind of answer everything and really address the heart of the matter is so key. So he basically says that this is, he says two things which I find really important. He says that it's the most important thing is to get better, is to heal, and really to follow the prescription of your professional, your mental health professional, which we always have to kind of assume is someone who's aware and sensitive of the kind of the cultural aspects of religion. But to get better, and even if that means quote unquote doing an avera, a technical I guess minute avera, the overall picture of this is the Shema. This is, you're not doing it out of a desire to sin. You're doing it because you need to get better, is the overarching principle here, which is so important.
Right, but I think it's also important what you mentioned, that once you invoke these ideas like avera lishma, we get worried about a slippery slope. One has to know when to apply it. We a few episodes ago we had Rabbi Aryeh Clapper on. We talked about pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh, the imperative to preserve one's life. I remember during COVID, everyone, not everyone, but you go on Facebook and Twitter, all these places of true, true discourse, right? So a lot of people discovered these terms called pikuach nefesh, and then they just threw it right and left. But I think this is why it's important to have people like you who have the halachic erudition as well as the mental health training to really be able to understand and responsibly apply concepts like this. It's not just for anyone to apply. Rav Asher Weiss is using it, but even he only uses it after finding other justifications. He didn't just straight off the bat say avera lishma. So I think that's noteworthy.
No, it's a great point. And I would say that even though Rav Asher Weiss's tshuva is groundbreaking and so integral to the understanding of treating Orthodox clients with OCD, from a purely clinical standpoint, if I was analyzing this, as a clinical psychologist about the fidelity to the treatment, there are some things that I would, in my humble opinion, with all due respect, kind of tweak or wish that Rav Asher Weiss would maybe even said it a different way.
And this is precisely why I wanted you on our podcast, which is to assess this from a mental health standpoint. Right. Credit must be given to Rav Asher Weiss, who he mentions he consulted some Rofim, some doctors at the beginning. But as we know, the field develops, and we don't know who he consulted. But I'm sure he did everything, lishma, due diligence. But I think what you wanted to talk about is really section Gimel, all the way at the end of the tshuva, in which he talks about a father/husband who's making kiddush at the table on Shabbos. So what does Rav Asher Weiss advise, and does that make sense with current mental health recommendations?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just to give one more just kind of word of background, is the idea is to treat OCD, you don't want to give what's called reassurance. The questioning, the doubting is what's called reassurance seeking, where someone's not sure and they need someone to tell them, yes, this is good, or no, this is wrong. And it's like drinking salt water. It's never ending. And part of the treatment is not to give that clear, definitive answer all the time, or not to give in to the OCD that's saying, maybe you're not Yotze, maybe you didn't do it right. And after Rav Asher Weiss spend many words saying, listen to your therapist, and this is avera l'shma, and it's a mitzvahs aseh. At the very end, he says, okay, but if you really want to be careful and avoid all problems, so have someone else make blessings for you, have someone else be motzi you for kiddush, let's say, like your wife on Friday night, since she's obligated to. So take yourself out of situations where you don't have to make the blessing, which is, from a clinical standpoint, feeding in, giving in to the OCD, and I kind of wish
So he brings back in the halachic analysis, because his whole tshuva, the subject is the individual with the OCD, and he says we can find an individualized halachic solution for you. But when you're at your Shabbos table and you have guests over and you have other people who have their own independent individual halachic obligations, we can't just give you a heter now, but who says you're being motzi everybody else? But you're saying is, by telling him to be choshesh for other people, that is really walking back everything that the tshuva led up to. because now
Yeah.
because now he's gonna say, well, I guess this isn't a real heter. I guess
Mm,
what I'm doing is not real because it's not real enough to count for other people.
exactly right. If it's allowed, it's allowed. I mean, if you shouldn't listen to your OCD, and it's like he says in other places, it's just in one place that Chuba, he says that Shareza teva mahuta shel machlas ze adam misayed atzmo kol azman bechareda shelo asar muta alav, that it's the nature of this machla, of this illness, to doubt yourself and to be always worried and anxious that you didn't do what was right. And then after saying that that's okay and don't worry, this is it's more important to get better, he says, he gives him a loophole, a way out, which we know in treating OCD could really undo the entire treatment, because in his mind he's probably thinking, I'm going to minimize as much as possible my opportunities to say blessings, so he may not even get better as quickly as we would like.
Wow. So I think this is a really good point, which is we have a tshuva of Rav Asher Weiss, which it really is groundbreaking. It's very, I don't mean in a political sense, but I mean, it's very progressive in terms of it taking into account mental health practices. I mean, I got a kick out of, he quotes a stipler on the top of the final page, but actually he's like, I was mechaving to the stipler who says, Sarich lomer lo behechlet bli tam. He actually says initially not to explain, don't give a rationale, just say what to do and don't explain anything, like what you said. But then you're saying at the end of the tshuva, he walks it back and almost undoes the advice. It's interesting because on the one hand, we have the considerations of this individual, but is it fair to everyone else who's not going to be yotze their obligations because of what he needs? Now you could say maybe that's kol yisrael zebazeh. Maybe we should be willing to compromise our own, I don't know if observance the right word, our own kiyum in this particular mitzvah in order to help our friend, especially when kiddush, at least the on the wine is midrabanan. So I think we certainly have what to work with. In our last few minutes that we have together, I'm wondering, you mentioned, and the reason we chose this tshuva of Asher Weiss is because it's a recent, really groundbreaking tshuva, any way you slice it, even with that asterisk at the end, like you mentioned, I think we would agree it's still a groundbreaking tshuva. So I'm curious, fast forwarding now to 2023, the end of 2023, when this recording is taking place, how do you see the broader field of Hilchos mental health developing? I admire the the book that you put together, in which you make sure at the beginning of every discussion there's a Torah source which you connect to peer-reviewed, evidence-based research. I know that there's different people out there. I know was it Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig got a book also, Nafshi B'Sheilasi. So I'm curious, how do you see this field developing? And then if there's anything else, any other places that we can learn from your Torah, any other ideas, I'd love for you to share that with us.
Yeah, I think it's a fastly growing and developing field. It's catching up to the medical field, which has, years and years of a head start of Sheila V'Tshuvot, to dealing with all kinds of different complicated medical issues. And at first there was a bit of a stigma in the Jewish community about mental health treatment in general, and I think we're seeing more and more that community leaders and all different Jewish communities are seeking out mental health treatment for things like OCD, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and either prefer to work with an Orthodox frum therapist, whether they're a rabbi or not, or at least have some type of halachic advisor. I know many frum therapists do have different rabbanim that they will call to speak to about a shiloh, or even the community rav of their patient. In order to, it's very important to know what's normal in the context of someone's culture. To share a quick anecdote, when I worked in a group practice in a clinic, my colleague, who was a Jewish woman but not observant or knowledgeable, she worked with a Lubavitch chassid who told her that every string of hair on his beard, it has kind of magical lights that that gives. She wanted to have him committed to an inpatient hospital. She asked me, she said, this guy, he's telling me that his hair is like light and he can't pull out one. And she asked me if that was normal, if that's like do I know about something like this? So I said, I think he's, quoting the Tanya, or that is I know the idea he's referring to, but his presentation is beyond the norm of a typical Lubavitch chassid.
Debilitating at that point.
Yeah, right. It's debilitating. It's extreme, right? He would, hold his beard all Shabbos, to not pull one out, things like that, where you have to be knowledgeable of the community norms as well as the psychological concepts to make a informed decision of what's pathological and what's not. So I think we're seeing more and more with podcasts and discussions like these where people are discussing how to treat mental health in a culturally sensitive way.
Absolutely. And I admire all the work that you're doing. I guess our listeners should know that if they ever need someone who's a rabbi and mental health professional and has good credentials in both of those areas, who could fuse both together, Rabbi Dr. Saul Haimoff is your man. I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise with us here today. And God willing, we'll put a link to your book in the description of the podcast for those who'd like to purchase it. And otherwise, wishing you continued hatzlacha in your very important work that you do.
Oh man, thank you so much for having me and being a voice to spread awareness about this very important topic.
Absolutely. All right, Kolto, take care.
Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.